Okay, yeah, so now we got everything connected, but let's say you also have a problem with your motor, which does occasionally happen sometimes. Now we're going to pretend like everything was okay with the controller, but now we got to basically address the motor. So we're going to kind of work backwards a little bit from where we were. So if the motor is now something that you need to replace and the controller is okay, we're going to go ahead and take out the motor connections again. Okay, so again, there's the 5-pin red Hall connector, which is one of them. Okay, there is the power cables. Okay, now actually in this case we also want to take out the rear cable as well, because it's kind of routed together. You'll see with the motor cables. We're going to take that one out as well, and then disconnect the 3 power motor cables. Again, be careful not to yank on the wires themselves, only on the blue connectors. Okay, so grab them kind of here and just gently wiggle them out. They're a little bit of a tight fit. Okay. All right. So now we can. Now what we got to do is we got to take the motor out of the hole here. You'll see there's a grommet here. Let's get this thing in view here. So this grommet just came out of this hole here. That's a little hard to see in this view. Let me see if I can. I'll take it out, then I'll show you where it came out of. Okay. Be careful as you pull it out not to damage the cables. Okay. All right. So there actually was a hole right here, which you can see where the grommet was in, and that's where the wires get routed out of the battery box. So I just, as you pull the wires out, you'll probably notice the grommet, which is right here, will just kind of pull out, and afterwards we'll have to put it back in place. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the motor off and replace it as well. Okay. Now, as you'll notice in this grommet, there's also the rear red LED cable, which is this 2-wire cable here. This gets routed through the same grommet, but since we're going to only be replacing the motor, we are going to disconnect that, take that out of the grommet. Okay. Right. Okay. And same thing goes over here. Actually going to take them all off. Now you want to do it kind of one at a time. So start with the 3 motor cables. Okay, again, be careful not to yank on the wire itself, just on the blue connector. You have to kind of pry things out carefully as you're doing this, one at a time, because they can't all go through at the same time. And lastly, the 5-wire cable. Okay, here's the Hall sensor cable. Okay, so I got the grommet off. So now, the only thing holding the motor to the board is the mechanical connection. So, scoot this over a little so you can see a little better. Got the center here. Alright. Okay, so now the next step is to take the motor off. So, the first thing we got to do is take off the transmission cover. And that has 2 screws here, 1, 2, okay. And you'll kind of notice afterwards as you take this off that there's these little spacers here. Let's move the battery box over for a second. Just get out of the way. You need kind of a big space as you're working here. Okay. So these tools out the way. Okay, so you see there are these spacers here that kind of go in between the transmission cover and the motor bracket. So as you undo the screw, this thing's just going to kind of float, so you have to kind of hold it so all the pieces don't just fall apart, but you'll see how that works in a second. Okay, so we take off these 2 screws. Okay, there's also a split lock washer and a flat washer, so just make sure you get everything off. Okay, take this next one out. Alright, so once you get them completely loose, just kind of lift it up. Now, what I was just telling you before is you have to kind of grab it like this so these little standoffs don't fall off. And if they fall off, it's not the end of the world. Just grab them. Make sure you keep everything together. But I'm going to try to keep them together. As you can see, they are here. Okay. So we'll set that aside for now. All right. So now we have access to the motor mounting screws. Now, in this case, you'll see a hex screw. You might actually see a Phillips screw. So whatever you have, use the appropriate tool. If it's a Phillips, use kind of a thicker head Phillips driver. If it's a hex, then you need an 8mm nut driver. Now, here's a critical piece. Do not use a socket driver like a a ratcheting socket driver. You just need a manual nut driver. A socket driver can put way too much torque and you may end up damaging the motor thread, so only use a manual driver. Okay, let's go ahead and loosen that. Okay. And I'll take this first screw all the way out. Again, there's a, you'll see there's a split lock washer and this flat washer, kind of keep them all together so when you put the new motor on, it'll be ready to go. Alright. Other side. Now the other one, of course, is the one holding the motor back on, so you want to kind of hold the motor underneath at the same time so it doesn't just fall right out. Okay. Now I'm going to loosen just a little bit, and I'm going to slide it this way towards the wheel so I can take the timing belt off, because we want to take that off before we pull the motor out, and just kind of, you can kind of keep it still attached here, but just kind of off to the side. Okay. I'll take out the last screw completely now. And hold on to the motor, and it's just going to drop right out. Okay, and be careful as you're pulling it through, not to bump this on the bracket so you don't damage the teeth. So just pull it straight out. Okay. So now here we go. We got a motor completely disassembled on the motor bracket. Okay. All right. Now, of course, you've taken this all apart because you want to put a new motor back on. So now, of course, you'll take your new motor and put that back. Now you'll notice there's actually 3 pairs of mounting holes here. Depending on how yours was built, it may use any one of those given pairs, but basically what you want to do is you want to mount it so that the wires kind of go at a 45-degree angle towards the board. 45, somewhere between a 45 to like I would say maybe a 90-degree, but you know, somewhere in that range. So you'll see which set works best. It's probably the original set that you have, but in case you're not sure where it was, just go ahead and put it back in. Okay, and be careful again not to bump the pulley as you're putting it back in. Okay, so in this case, I believe I was using the middle set, so I'm going to use the middle pair. Okay, and you can take your nut driver again and start getting it threaded. And you have to kind of eyeball it a little bit to get it going. You might want to even do it by hand initially, just to kind of make sure you're in the right spot. You can also use the driver. Okay. Tricky to get the first one going, but once you get that going, it should be a little more straightforward. There we go. Just make sure the motor is in the right position. Okay, let's actually do it. You know, I think it's going to be easier to do the outer one first because you can kind of see this one better. So probably easier to start with the outer one, and then you can see a little better what you're doing, and then you go back to the inner one if it's a little tricky to get the inner one first. Okay, so I'm going to get that going. Hopefully this time I'll have a little better luck. Yep, there we go. So I got the outer one going. I'm not going to tighten it all the way yet because I want to make sure I'm going in the right slot. Make sure you got the one that's opposite. Okay. Alright. Okay. So now you'll basically want to tighten it all the way, but not very hard. Just kind of get it tight, but then back it up just to here, maybe like a half turn of the screw. So you can slide the motor back and forth, maybe in a little bit more, maybe a tiny bit more. Okay, that's good. Okay. Now you can slide the motor all the way towards the drive wheel, and that'll give you enough space to get the timing belt on. So now for the timing belt, you just want to kind of squeeze it. It's a little easier if I turn it this way, you can see a little bit. Yeah. So you just want to kind of squeeze it against the drive pulley teeth and kind of wrap it over the edge here. Okay, so just be careful not to kind of push it into the sharp edge of the flange. You just like kind of gradually push it over the edge and make sure it goes over completely. Okay, I'm going to turn it back. Alright, so the next step actually is to tension the timing belt. This is an important step. There's a separate video that shows how to do it, but I'll show you the basics of how you do it without the details of actually tuning it to the right tension. But basically, you should have gotten in your original Metroboard order these 2 pieces. This is what we call the tensioning piece, this kind of plastic piece. It might be kind of gray in color. Okay, and then there's this little screw and pin that's used to kind of push against the motor and tension it properly. So let's go ahead and put those in place. This view is a little better for that particular step. Okay, so this little flange here, you can see, is going to kind of get tucked in under here. Okay, so there's only kind of one orientation to put it here. And there's also a screw here. Okay. There's a screw hole, or a bigger hole right here that you want to basically put that pin in, and that's going to push on the motor and then kind of gradually tension the belt. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna actually disconnect this front cable completely so I don't have this tethered to the battery box, and I can work a little more comfortably for this stuff. So let's put the battery box to the side for now. Okay. Alright, so we're going to basically, you'll see that there's a flathead screw there, or flat opening. That's kind of the orientation that you want to get things roughly oriented as you put it in. Okay, so the flathead side goes into the hole, okay, the hole over here. Okay. But first you want to basically take this piece and wedge it in like that. Okay, and let's turn it so you can see a little better from this view, at least to get it started. Okay, so you got that piece in there, and then you want to kind of back that out as much as you need to. Actually, you probably want to put that in first now that I think about it. Let's do this in this order, it'll be a little bit easier. Okay, and let's see, actually here we go, here's the right order. Okay, so you basically kind of get it roughly in place like that. I'll wedge it in there. You may need to move the motor a little bit to get it kind of in the right position. Oops. Let's try this again. Okay. Okay, like that. Okay. So the screw is kind of pushing in that section there. Okay. And get it in that hole hopefully soon. So that works out. A little bit tricky because you can't really see it, but maybe you need to move them forward a little, move the motor a little bit more forward, and then it should find the spot. There we go. So yeah, I guess the key is you basically want to move the motor in the tensioned direction because it may not fit initially until you kind of shift the motor that way. So now you can see it kind of sits nicely in there, and now we can go ahead and start tensioning it. So you can either use a 3/16 inch T-handle Allen key like this, or this is actually metric 4.5. So if you have metric 4.5 will work, or 3/16 inch non-metric, and you just want to kind of start tightening that thing. Okay, and you'll see that it'll start pushing on the motor, causing the time belt to get tension. So I'm going to actually flip it around so we can see the belt now. Okay, but you're going to kind of keep it in that position. Okay, so as tools are concerned, if this falls out, it'll still kind of hold everything in place. So you just gradually tighten that screw. Now there's a separate video that shows you exactly how to tension it, okay? And I'm not going to show it in this video because it's a little more detailed, but I'm just going to show you the process of increasing the tension. And in this case I'm going to kind of eyeball it, but you'll see another video which shows how to tension it properly, okay? So now, once you got it to the right tension, okay, just kind of spin it freely, a little bit more. I can tell it's a little bit loose. I'm going to go a tiny bit more. You don't want to over tension it, that's for sure, but you also don't want it too loose. Okay, so presumably you got to the right tension. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten these two screws that hold the motor in place. Alright, now again, remember, be careful about not over torquing them because you can strip the threads on the motor mounting threads. So tighten them so they're nice and firm, but don't go too crazy, okay, because you don't want to strip those threads. You may have a Phillips driver here, like I said. In this case we're using a hex, but you may have a Phillips head here. Okay, alright, now that we've got the tension right, you got to go ahead and take the tensioning tool out, okay? So you can flip it around again, loosen it, okay, a little bit. The whole thing should just kind of come out, okay? Just pull that guy out, the tensioning piece, and this guy. Don't leave it in place. Set it aside for the next time you need to tension your timing belt. Okay, now go ahead and, yeah, that's actually a little bit tight, but for the purposes of this video, it's fine just to show you the process. Okay. So sometimes it's helpful to have like a little piece of foam or something underneath the deck to kind of keep it more level so it doesn't flip over on you. But you can use whatever's handy. So now we're going to go ahead and put the transmission cover back on. Okay. So remember, you got this little assembly. You have to kind of hold these so they don't just fall out when you're trying to put them back in. But they're basically going to go back into these two threaded holes, one here and one there. Okay. One there, one there, okay? Just kind of roughly line them up and kind of hold it as you're doing it so they don't just fall apart. And you may have to kind of look from the side as you're doing it. Like, it's helpful to kind of, this one's a little easier to see, the outer one. The inner one's a little more hidden, so you can kind of hand tighten them a little bit to get them going. And then same thing over here, just kind of look at that hole and align it and get it hand tightened to get the threads in there. And then once you know you're in place, it's loose here, but you can see it's not coming out. Go go ahead and tighten it. Now there's a little bit of play here. You want to kind of make sure that the edge here parallels the wheel. Like there's a little bit of play slop there, so just kind of make sure it's an even gap there as you're tightening it. You can always adjust it once you get a little closer, but make sure it's roughly a consistent gap. And don't go too crazy on these either. You don't want to strip the heads or strip the motor bracket itself, which has the threads in it. So make sure that gap is nice and even there. It should be like at least about 1/8 of an inch or about 3 millimeters consistent across the wheel and the transmission cover. Okay, so now we got the motor back on. It's been tensioned properly. Now we got to put everything back together. So the first step now is to put the grommet back on over the motor cables. Okay, so again, we got to do it kind of one at a time because you can't fit them all in at the same time. So the first one I want to do is the red 5-pin connector, which is the Hall motor connector, Hall sensor connector. Okay, so one at a time. All right, you can start feeding the motor power cables one at a time. Okay, and be careful not to yank on the cables, just kind of gently pulling through. And then finally we got the rear motor cable. I'm sorry, the rear LED cable, which is the 2-pin red connector. Alright, again, be careful also on these not to yank because you don't want to damage the wires where they kind of go into the connector here, so just kind of carefully pull, try to pull on the wires themselves, not in the connector, so that you don't end up pulling those out of their position. Okay, so we're just going to kind of get that grommet a little bit shifted, kind of roughly where it needs to be. We may have to adjust things a little bit once we get it, the battery box reassembled. But you want to kind of pull it far enough out where you can adjust it later. Don't have it too close to this end, okay? Because we need to kind of route the wires inside first. Okay, so let's bring our battery box back and reconnect everything. Okay. So again, you got to route all those cables through this hole right here, okay? So, and the grommet you're not going to put in right away. The grommet you're going to put back in at the very end after we put the battery box. But just kind of keep that in mind as you're feeding these through. So, again, we'll just kind of feed these through. And it's a little hard to see here, but you'll see what we're basically just feeding them through these holes here. So I'm going to kind of keep it in that view to get a rough idea. Again, one at a time. You may not be able to fit them all in at the exact same time because of the connectors themselves. Okay. Alright. Once you get them all in, you can lay the battery box back down. Okay. Now, looks like that got kind of in a bad position, so I'm going to carefully pull it back out. Alright. You want to kind of get it close to where it needs to be because you don't have a lot of extra length in these cables. So you have to get everything kind of roughly in position. So let's go ahead and connect the 3 power cables, 3 colored power cables of the motor. Okay. So again, remember we have 3 colors. In this case, we have blue, green, and yellow. Now, what you may notice that there's a color, like a piece of electrical tape on the motor side that doesn't match the color of the wire. That's the color that you should use to line things up. Now, in this case, this doesn't have it, but you may, for example, see a blue wire that has a yellow piece of electrical tape or a yellow wire that has a blue piece. So use the electrical tape as your guide to matching the colors on the controller side, okay? So in this case, I'm going to go green to green. This particular motor doesn't have this, but I know that the colors are actually swapped. So yellow actually goes to blue, okay? So that's going to go yellow to blue, okay? And blue actually goes to yellow. Okay, again, the color of the tape will tell you the correct order. Okay, so kind of tuck those down in there. You don't want them hanging over this edge, going over the heatsink, so they should definitely be tucked down in this area. But again, be careful not to let them go under this where the screw goes, because then it may have a screw may end up puncturing it as you reassemble it. Okay, and let's go ahead and put the Hall connector back in place. Remember, the 5-pin Hall connector goes here, not here. This is for the front receiver. Do not mix those up. Very important. Okay, the rear LED cable goes right from there. We need to hit it a little bit. There it goes. Okay. We'll adjust these a little bit once they're all connected. And then finally, front receiver cable. Make sure the pins are straight. If the pins don't go on easily, then you might need to straighten a little bit or just kind of wiggle a little bit until it goes on. Okay, there you go. Now, this is also a very important step. If you remember, we took off the hot glue way back when between these 5-pin connectors. I'm going to put a little bit back on now. So we're just using like one of these like craft glue guns. It's like a high temperature mini glue gun. It uses these glue sticks like this. These kind of mini glue sticks. Doesn't matter the exact kind, but just any kind of hot glue gun is probably good enough. And you want to just dribble a little bit of hot glue between the red connector and the mating white header that it goes on the board. So I'm going to kind of tilt it a little bit so you can see a little better. So I'm just going to dribble a little bit of glue there, just overlapping. Hold on, I might need to put another glue stick in for this to actually come out. Yeah, let's go ahead and make sure you have enough pressure there to get it going. Okay, I'm just going to dribble a little bit of glue in there. You can always peel it off later if you ever have to take it off, but this will keep these from vibrating loose. So that's that one. That's the motor cable. And I'm going to do the same thing for the front receiver cable. Those are the ones that are more prone to vibrating loose. And they're also kind of the most critical ones, so we don't want those coming off while you're riding. So there we go. We put a little bit of glue overlapping the red and the white header. And yeah, and that should keep those from vibrating loose. And just wait like maybe about 30 seconds for those to cool down before we go ahead and assemble the battery box back to the deck. But in the meantime, you can make sure the cables are in a good spot. Make sure nothing's getting yanked on. Nothing's going over the heatsink, so you want to make sure that everything's in place. Now at this point, since everything is electrically connected, we want to make sure that everything is working before you go ahead and put the battery backs on. So now you can go ahead and turn the switch back on. You should hear your normal beeps. And I'm going to go get my remote real quick. So of course you want to make sure everything's working before we go ahead and put this thing back together. So go ahead and make sure the drive wheel's on the air. Nothing's going to move in this case. Press the green button. Okay. Try ramping it up. Make sure everything's working okay. Okay. Check that the buzzer is working, of course, because of course you heard it when it turned on, but you can always check it again by pushing it forward. Okay, so it looks like we're okay. Looks like everything's working okay. So let's go ahead and turn it back off during the reassembly step. So we're almost done. Now we just got to put the battery box back on the deck. Okay, if any foam did come off in the process of taking it off, you want to kind of push it back into place. You may need some replacement foam if it got badly damaged in the process of removing, but hopefully it'll be okay. If not, you can always take another piece, either from your local hardware store, just like a weather stripping foam that you can use. So it's pretty commonly found. It's just a soft foam, basically. Okay, now as you close the battery box, what you want to do is the front receiver cable is going to kind of get routed on. So let me get this in the right spot here. It looks like it's kind of a little awkward here, but let's go ahead and move it in the right spot. So the front receiver cable is going to go on this side of this screw mount. Okay, so don't get it wedged in here or here. It's going to be over here on this. There's kind of, you'll probably see a little divot like you can see here where it was originally placed. So when you reassemble it, just make sure that it ends up being in that spot. Okay. So what we're going to do is, it's a little bit tricky, but we're just going to take our 4 mounting screws here. Okay. These are the battery box mounting screws. All right. Like I said, you may have a Phillips. In this case, these are button head cap screws, which use an 1/8 inch Allen driver, but you may have Phillips, so whatever you have, go ahead and use those again. And I'm just going to roughly place them. Let's go ahead and shift this back so you can see a little better. It's back in the center here. Okay, so you're just going to kind of roughly place them on the original holes. Okay. Alrighty. And then we're just going to tilt the battery box, okay, and kind of get this roughly in position here, okay? And this is a very important step. You want to be careful as you put these back into place that they don't get cross-threaded. It's kind of easy to do that in some scenarios, so be a little bit careful. You want to kind of manually get them going without too much force. If you feel any resistance at all, you should back them out, because it means you're about to cross-thread them, so you need to be a little bit careful. Okay, so you have to kind of get it roughly in place. You can start with a lower one. Okay, and again, I'm going to use my 1/8 inch driver, which is this guy, to mount it. But if you had a Phillips one, just use a Phillips. Okay, so I'm going to start with the lower one. Okay, and just kind of eyeball getting in there. I can kind of see the first one. The first one's a little bit easier to get going. Okay, just feeling a little bit of resistance. I'm going to back it out. Make sure I'm in the right spot again. You have to go kind of going straight, not at an angle too much. Okay, otherwise it may get cross through it. So don't force it. If you feel any resistance, it means you're not going in straight. And you don't want to force it because then you'll end up damaging either the screw or the clip. Okay, so that first one's in. Now I'm moving over to one of these. Again, make sure the cable, there we go, see the cable? The cable should be on the side of the screw that's closer to the outside of the box, so don't get it trapped in between the two screws. Okay, so let's go ahead and get that one going. And you have to kind of eyeball a little bit where you're going. Find the right spot. There you go. It's helpful to have a flashlight, but there we go. So I got that one going. So once you get two in, like, you kind of start with the opposite two. Like I got this one going and that one going. And that will kind of keep the battery box from moving around too much. And then we're going to go back to this guy and get that one going again. Make sure if it's not going straight, just back it out and try it again. Don't force it. It should go in nice and easy. If there's any resistance, back it out. Same thing here. Okay, that one's going in okay, I'm happy to say. Alright. Once you get them all in a little bit, the hard part's done. Go ahead and turn it now in this position so it's not going to fall off. I'm going to go back to the power driver, but you can use the manual driver. You don't want to go too crazy, but you want to make sure these are firm. So I'm going to set this to kind of a low torque setting and go ahead and tighten those. Okay. All the front ones. Okay. So that's that. Alright, so now the battery box is back in place. So we've got a few last things to do to get things back in order. Alright. So, first thing we're going to do is, it's actually probably could have shifted a little bit more. It's getting pulled on maybe a little bit more than I'd like to. I'm going to actually loosen this. You can see this one is a little more slack here, which means it probably has not enough slack inside. It's hard for me to push it in at this point, so I'm going to loosen that actually. So if that happens, just going to loosen, don't take it off all the way, just enough so you can kind of squish it back. So I'm going to loosen this guy a little bit. Not even the back one, just a little bit. Well, maybe I need a little more than that. I'll loosen this a little bit too. Okay. Now that they're a little bit loose, I can kind of adjust the position of the cables a little bit better, at least this one, which is going to kind of clamp. So now I can kind of get it. Well, you want to kind of use the existing hole as your guide. So there's a little hole, the original hole that this was mounted on, you can see right there. So we're just going to kind of shift it back into that same position, make that kind of nice S shape to it. And we're going to go back to the Phillips driver now, which we started with, and we put the strainer release in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now that I got that in the right position, I'm going to go ahead and actually tighten these battery box screws again. Now in this case, I actually need to go back to my socket driver. Forgot that I still have to tighten those. So let's go ahead and re-tighten those now. Okay. Alright. Perfect. Now, flip this back over on its back. Go back to the Phillips driver for those cable clamp screws. So remember, we got one in the front. Okay. This you want to set, if you're going to use a power driver, do it on a very low setting because you don't want to strip the wood. It's kind of best actually to kind of go backwards first and then go forward. That way you use existing threads without risk of stripping. Okay. Now go forward. Okay. Just enough so that the cable clamp can't really move. You don't need to go too crazy on that, otherwise you might strip the wood. Now on this one, as I mentioned before, we need to adjust the position of these wires a bit Okay, so the grommet, as you'll see, is actually popped out. Okay, so we need to push that back in place. But before we do so, I want to get kind of the wires roughly, this kind of black mesh sheet, you want to get it roughly in position. So this one has a little more slack here than I need, the rear LED cable, so I'm going to kind of carefully pull it through here so it's a little more even with the motor cable, just so we don't have too much slack there. It's okay to have a little bit, but just not too much. Yeah. Alright. There we go. So you kind of want to lay it like that so that the motor cable has kind of a nice curve like that. Not really, it can kind of be close to the front riser, or sorry, this is the rear riser, close to the rear riser, but you don't want it like pushed all the way against it or pulled way too far. So just kind of get it roughly in that nice shape there. Okay. And then the rear LED cable, you can see, is just kind of angle it a little bit so you can see a little better there. It's just kind of having a little bit of an S curve, but not too much slack and not too little either, of course. And then we just got to basically push the grommet now back into place. So you just have to kind of work its way into the hole again. It takes a little bit of squishing, but it'll go in there. Okay, there you go. There's a bit of a tight fit, so just be patient with it, but it will go in. Alright, there we go. So you can see it's laying flat now. I tilt it up a little bit so you can see a little better. It's laying nice and flat around the entire perimeter of the grommet, and that's how you know it's back in place. Alright, again, if you still need to adjust the mesh cables from the motor or the rear LED, you can kind of still push them in and out a little bit here. It's helpful to get them kind of roughly in place before you put the grommet in, but then you can always kind of pull them in and out a little bit to get them where you want them to be. So now we got to put this final cable clamp back on. This was the original one that we took off, and this goes over both wires, so you're kind of feed both the thick cable and the thin one through this, and then the screw side kind of goes inward towards where the motor is. Okay, so make sure you're wrapped around both of them. And again here, just check to make sure you have some nice curve here. Okay, you don't want to tighten it where the motor is now going to turn and then get yanked on the cable. It has to have a little bit of slack, of course. So we put that last cable clamp screw, which is these wood screws. They may be black or silver depending on which version you have of our product. Okay, again, it's helpful to kind of go back, just go back in the original hole that's there. You may want to go backwards first, then forward to make sure you don't strip the original threads. There you go. Okay. And a little bit tighter on that, just the hair tighter. There we go. Okay. So again, you can see the way that worked out. See that screw is right there. This has a nice curve to it. This has kind of an S curve to it. The rear LED cable. And again, just turn it, make sure as you lean on the truck that nothing's rubbing too excessively and that nothing's getting yanked on. Should be a nice fit there. And let's make sure everything's still working now that we've put everything back together, so we can go ahead and turn it back on. Again, slide this over a little bit so you can see everything. Alright. Alright, back in business. Alright, and you're good to go. Enjoy your ride.